the mind behind the weapon, the Bren gun and the thinkers who perfected squad support. The workshop in Brno smelled of gun oil and winter. Václav Holek stood at the workbench, hands blackened with carbon residue, studying the curved magazine lying beside a half-assembled receiver. Outside, sleet tapped against the windows of Československa Zbrojovka like impatient fingers. It was January 1924, and the metal before him, 23 carefully machined parts that would become the ZBVZ. 26 represented everything the Great War had taught him about what soldiers needed and what armies refused to see. He ran his thumb along the gas piston assembly, feeling the precision tolerances his team had spent 6 months perfecting. The design was elegant in its simplicity: top-loading magazine for prone firing, quick-change barrel for sustained engagement, gas-operated action that could function in mud or ice. Every curve, every angle answered a question written in the blood of men who had died because their weapons jammed, overheated, or required 4 soldiers to move. But elegance was not enough. Not in 1924, when the empires that had consumed the world were busy forgetting the lessons they had paid for in trenches and barbed wire. "We should add more weight," Holek's mentor suggested from across the room, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Make it look more substantial. Generals trust heavy weapons." "Generals aren't the ones carrying it 20 kilometers, Holek replied quietly. "A man who can move with his firepower is worth 3 who cannot." The Great War had ended 6 years earlier, but for Holek, it had never truly stopped. He had been too young to fight, 18 when the armistice came, but old enough to read the casualty lists from the Italian front, the Eastern Front, the Western Front. Old enough to understand that the Austro-Hungarian Empire his father served had collapsed not from lack of courage, but from industrial inadequacy. The machine guns that should have protected Czech conscripts jammed in alpine snow. The artillery that should have held defensive lines arrived too late, or with the wrong ammunition. And the infantry, always the infantry, advanced into interlocking fields of fire with rifles that could not suppress, could not adapt, could not save them. He had grown up in his father's machine shop in the industrial quarter of Brno, where the Habsburg Empire's appetite for precision tools had created a generation of craftsmen who understood that every mechanism was a conversation between intent and metal. His father had taught him to read blueprints before he could read books, to feel tolerances with his fingertips, to understand that the best designs whispered their purpose rather than shouted it. When the new Czechoslovak Republic needed engineers for its fledgling arms industry, Holek had walked into the Zbrojovka office with a portfolio of sketches and a single argument: that modern war demanded mobile firepower at the squad level, and that every nation still clinging to bolt-action rifles and crew-served machine guns was preparing to lose the next conflict. They had hired him on the spot. Now, 2 years into the design process, the prototype was nearly ready. The Czechoslovak army had shown interest, enough interest to fund continued development. But beyond their small nation's borders, the world remained indifferent. The French clung to their Chauchas and Hotchkiss guns. The Germans were still disarmed under Versailles, nursing grievances and planning futures. The British Empire, vast and victorious, saw no reason to question the Lewis gun that had served them adequately enough. Adequately. That word haunted Holek's nights. How many men had died because their equipment was adequate rather than excellent? The first test came on a February morning so cold the firing range crew worked in double gloves. The ZB VZ-26 sat on sandbags, its barrel angled toward target frames 400 meters downrange. Holek's hands trembled as he loaded the curved magazine, not from cold, but from the knowledge that the next 60 seconds would either validate 2 years of obsession or prove him a dreamer. He pressed the trigger. The gun fired with a measured rhythm, 30 rounds per minute, exactly as designed. The recoil was manageable, the sound crisp rather than thunderous. When he released the trigger, the silence felt weighted with possibility. "Again," his mentor said. In the mud. They dragged the weapon through slush, packed the action with half-frozen earth, and fired again. It functioned. They submerged it in ice water, fired it. It functioned. They ran it until the barrel glowed, swapped it out in 12 seconds, and continued firing. It functioned. By sunset, the Czechoslovak procurement officer was drafting adoption papers. But that small victory came with a bitter awareness. The ZB version 26 would serve the Czech military, 40,000 citizens under arms, defending a nation the size of a modest province. Beyond those borders, where millions marched and vast arsenals determined fates, no one was paying attention to what a team of engineers in Brno had proven possible. Holek stood in the empty workshop that night, holding the weapon that would soon bear his country's designation, 20 pounds of machined steel and walnut, a solution to problems that generals in Paris, London, and Berlin did not yet admit existed. He wondered if he would live long enough to see them learn. If stories like this make you question what you do when everyone says you're wrong, but you know you're right, tell us in the comments. And stay with us for the next chapters. The British Empire's reckoning began not in London, but in the scrub hills of the northwest frontier, where doctrine met reality under a sun that made lies impossible. Lieutenant Colonel James Ashford sat in his tent outside Peshawar in the spring of 1928, reading field reports that would never be discussed in polite company at the War Office. His men, the 2nd Battalion, Highland Light Infantry, had spent 3 weeks engaged in what military dispatches euphemistically called pacification operations. What that meant in practice was watching tribesmen with jezails and determination pin down British sections armed with Lee Enfield rifles and inadequate fire support. The Lewis gun, standard issue since the Great War, had failed them repeatedly, too heavy for rapid redeployment, too complex for field maintenance in dust and heat, too slow to bring into action when sudden contact demanded immediate suppression. Ashford had lost 11 men in engagements that should have ended in minutes if his sections had possessed mobile automatic weapons. He wrote his 3rd report to headquarters, detailing casualties and requesting evaluation of foreign light machine gun designs. Like the previous 2, it would gather dust in a filing cabinet while procurement officers debated budgets and doctrinal purity. 3,000 kilometers northwest in Brno, Václav Holek was living a different kind of frustration. The ZB Verzenta 26 had entered Czechoslovak service in 1926, and battlefield reports from border units were unanimously positive. Reliable, mobile, effective. But international interest remained non-existent. France had its Châtellerault. Germany, rearming in secret, was developing the MG-34. Britain showed no interest in foreign designs, regardless of their merit. Holek's childhood had not prepared him for this particular kind of failure, the failure of being right in a world that refused to listen. He'd grown up in a household where his mother sang Czech folk songs, while his father built precision instruments for Habsburg officers who barely acknowledged their existence. The Empire had treated Czech craftsmen as useful tools, valuable for their hands, but not their minds. That casual dismissal had taught young Václav a crucial lesson, that being correct meant nothing if you lacked the power to make others see. His father had died in 1919, worn out by decades of meticulous work that earned respect but never equity. Holek had stood at the funeral, thinking about all the beautiful mechanisms his father had built for men who never knew his name. He had promised himself then that his work would be different, that if he created something truly necessary, the world would have no choice but to acknowledge it. But the world, he was learning, always had a choice, and usually chose comfort over truth. In 1930, Holek married Anna, a teacher from Prague who understood that she was joining her life to a man already married to an idea. On their wedding night, in a modest apartment overlooking the Svratka River, she had asked him a single question. If they never see what you've built, will it have been worth it? He had not answered immediately. Outside, the river moved in darkness, patient and indifferent. "The weapon exists," he finally said. "That means it was possible. Someone, someday, will need what we've proven can be done." She had kissed his forehead with the tenderness of someone accepting a truth they wished were different. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. Captain Anthony Williams, British military attaché to Czechoslovakia, had been invited to a routine demonstration of Czech military equipment in the summer of 1932. He attended more from diplomatic courtesy than genuine interest, until he watched a single gunner with a ZB-VZ 26 suppress 6 target arrays at distances up to 600 meters, while a second operator swapped barrels and fed ammunition without breaking the rhythm of fire. Williams was a practical man who had served in Flanders and Mesopotamia. He knew the difference between range performance and combat utility. What he watched that afternoon in the Czech countryside was not a laboratory curiosity, but a solution to every suppression problem he had encountered in a decade of service. He filed a report. It was ignored. He filed a second report, this time citing specific tactical scenarios where the ZB would outperform British standard issue. It was acknowledged and shelved. On his third attempt, Williams bypassed normal channels. He arranged for a ZB-VZ-26 to be shipped directly to the Small Arms Committee at the Royal Small Arms Factory in Enfield, accompanied by a note that was more challenge than request. "Test this against our current inventory. Then explain to His Majesty's soldiers why we're denying them superior tools." The weapon arrived at Enfield on a grey October morning in 1932, packed in cosmoline and Czech optimism. The testing officer, Major Harold Thornton, approached the foreign design with the skepticism that 2 decades of British military superiority had earned him. The Empire's arsenals had armed the largest volunteer army in history. British engineering had built the tanks that broke the Hindenburg Line. British innovation had given the world the Maxim gun, the Vickers, the Lewis. What could a minor nation barely a decade old possibly teach them? He ran the ZB through standard trials: accuracy, reliability, maintainability, then environmental tests, rain, mud, dust, extreme cold, then stress tests, sustained fire until failure. The ZB did not fail. The Lewis gun, tested in parallel, jammed on the 4th environmental scenario. Thornton wrote his findings with the clinical precision of a man whose worldview had just been quietly demolished. The Czech weapon is superior in every measurable category. Adoption should proceed with utmost urgency. The report reached the Procurement Committee in November 1932, and there it stopped, not because of the weapon's performance, but because of what acceptance would mean. How could Britain, the greatest empire in human history, admit that a nation the size of Scotland had solved a problem British arsenals could not? The answer, apparently, was that it couldn't. Not yet. Not while pride still outweighed the mathematics of soldiers' lives. The offices of the Small Arms Committee in Enfield resembled a courtroom more than a design bureau. Wood panelling, formal seating, an atmosphere where protocol mattered more than performance. In the winter of 1933, the committee convened to address what internal memoranda delicately termed the Czech question. Major Thornton presented his findings with the emotional restraint expected of an officer who had served at the Somme. Numbers did not lie. The ZB-VZ-26 outperformed the Lewis gun in reliability by 43%, in sustained fire by 62%, in field maintenance simplicity by margins that made comparison almost embarrassing. Across the table, Brigadier Sir Edmund Graves represented institutional memory and institutional resistance. He had overseen procurement during the Great War, when British industry had built the arsenal that equipped millions. The suggestion that foreign engineering had surpassed British capability felt less like tactical criticism and more like civilizational insult. "The Lewis served adequately in France," Graves said, his voice carrying the weight of undeniable history. "Hundreds of thousands produced, battles won. Adequately, Thornton repeated, and let the word hang in the air like an accusation. Sir, with respect, adequacy is measured in the reports I've read from the frontier. Men dying because their fire support jams in dust or requires a crew of 3 to deploy. Those are operational challenges, not procurement failures. Those are preventable casualties, sir. The silence that followed had texture, the specific density of institutional pride meeting undeniable mathematics. The compromise that emerged was neither victory nor defeat, but a peculiarly British solution. Adopt the design's principles while maintaining the fiction of British engineering supremacy. License the Czech pattern. Rechamber it from 792mm to 303 British. Redesign components to match imperial manufacturing standards and supply chains. Test it to destruction, then test it again. Transform it from a foreign innovation into something that could be called, with technical accuracy if not emotional honesty, a British weapon. The project was assigned to a team at Enfield, led by George Patchett, a designer whose wartime service had taught him the difference between elegant theory and brutal function. His initial reaction to the assignment combined professional humility with personal frustration. "We're being asked to perfect someone else's excellence," he told his lead machinist over tea in the factory canteen, "because we can't admit they've beaten us to it." "Can we?" the machinist asked. "Perfect it, I mean." Patchett considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. The ZB was brilliant, simple, reliable, combat-proven. But brilliance designed for Czech manufacturing and Czech logistics would need translation for British scale and British operational doctrine. "Perhaps," he said, "if we approach it with humility instead of pride." The redesign process consumed 2 years. Patchett's team worked with Czechoslovak technical documentation, adjusting tolerances, refining the gas regulator system, improving sight alignment, enhancing barrel change mechanisms. Every modification had to maintain the core genius of Holek's original, while adapting it to the vast machinery of British military production. Meanwhile, the international situation darkened. Hitler consolidated power in Germany. Mussolini mobilized in Ethiopia. The illusion of permanent peace that had characterized the 1920s was crumbling into the realization that the Great War had settled nothing, only created the conditions for its sequel. British military planners began grudging conversations about rearmament, about the scale of forces that would be needed if war came again. But whether the current infantry doctrine, riflemen supported by crew-served weapons, would suffice against modern combined arms tactics. The ZB, rechristened the Bren from Brno and Enfield, a name that acknowledged partnership while softening the sting of dependence, completed trials in 1937. The final design weighed 23 pounds, fired, and 303 British ammunition at 500 rounds per minute with selectable rate of fire, and could have its barrel changed in less than 5 seconds by a soldier wearing gloves. It was, by every measurable standard, perfect for its purpose. In June 1938, the Bren gun entered official service with British forces and was immediately resented by the men who would have to carry it. Sergeant Frank Morrison of the 1st Battalion, Royal Berkshire Regiment, received his section's first Bren in a depot outside Aldershot with the enthusiasm of a man being handed additional responsibilities. He was 34, a veteran of the Waziristan campaign, and deeply suspicious of anything that disrupted the familiar rhythms of infantry tactics he had spent 16 years mastering. The Bren required new squad organization. One man fed the gun, another spotted targets, riflemen covered flanks. It was choreography, not the straightforward violence of volley fire and bayonet charge that Morrison had been trained to execute. "Makes us soft," he told his corporal while cleaning the weapon for the first time. "Dependent on machinery. What happens when it jams in contact?" "Then we use our rifles," the corporal said, "same as always." But the same as always was dying, even as they spoke. In September 1938, as Britain braced for war over Czechoslovakia, the nation that had designed the weapon now protecting British infantry, the Munich Agreement bought temporary peace at the cost of permanent shame. Václav Holek listened to radio reports of his country's dismemberment with the numb recognition that history cared nothing for justice. The nation that had given Britain the tools for its own defense was now being sacrificed to maintain that same Britain's strategic comfort. He stood in his workshop in Brno, now part of an occupied protectorate, and held a ZB Visa 26 that his factory would soon be forced to produce for Wehrmacht use. The weapon had no loyalty. It would serve whoever manufactured it, kill on behalf of whoever pulled its trigger. The genius he had poured into its design was neutral, a solution to tactical problems that made no distinction between liberators and conquerors. Anna found him there at midnight, hands on the weapon that had defined half his life. "Was it worth it?" she asked, echoing her wedding night question. This time he had an answer. "I don't know," he said, "but it exists, and existence is the only certainty we have. Do you think you'd fight the system for what you believe works, or accept what doctrine says is impossible? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real innovation stories from history. The transformation of skepticism into dependence happened slowly, then all at once, the way doctrinal shifts always occur when reality stops accepting excuses. Through late 1938 and early 1939, British infantry sections grudgingly integrated the Bren into their tactical vocabulary. Training manuals were rewritten, fire and movement drills adjusted. The old rhythm of advance, individual riflemen providing covering fire for advancing comrades, gave way to something more coordinated. The Bren became the anchor point, the axis around which infantry sections rotated. Sergeant Morrison, who had predicted the weapon would make soldiers soft, found himself becoming its unlikely evangelist. During section live-fire exercises on Salisbury Plain in February 1939, he watched his gunner suppress 3 target positions in succession while the rifle team maneuvered into flanking positions. The tactical math was undeniable. One man with a Bren could achieve what had previously required an entire section firing in coordinated volleys. But mathematics only mattered when lives were at stake. And in the spring of 1939, as German forces absorbed what remained of Czechoslovakia and set their sights on Poland, everyone understood that the mathematics would soon become personal. At the Enfield factory, George Patchett watched production ramp up with a mixture of professional satisfaction and creeping dread. The assembly lines that had once built Lee Enfield rifles by the thousand now added Bren guns to their output. 10 per day in early 1939, then 20, then 50. Each weapon required 47 precision-machined parts, assembled by craftsmen who took quiet pride in building something that might save British lives. But Patchett knew what the production numbers really meant. Britain was preparing for war on a scale that would dwarf the Great War's butcher's bill. Every Bren rolling off the line was an admission that conflict was inevitable, that the peace purchased at Munich was merely a pause in a larger tragedy. He thought often of Václav Holek, the Czech designer whose work had made all of this possible. They had never met, communicated only through technical documents and patent filings. But Patchett felt a strange kinship with this man who had seen what needed to exist and built it despite institutional indifference. In occupied Czechoslovakia, Holek was living the consequence of being right. The Brno factory had been seized by German authorities, its production redirected to Wehrmacht use. The ZB Visa 26, his creation, his answer to the lessons of the Great War, now equipped German infantry sections preparing to carve up Europe. He worked under supervision, making small modifications to streamline production, his mind running parallel calculations. How many Czech designs would be used against the British who had licensed them? How many innovations intended to save lives would instead enable conquest? Anna asked him once if he regretted designing the weapon. "No," he said, "I regret that weapons are necessary. But necessity is not the same as regret. The philosophical distinction would be tested in September 1939. When German forces crossed into Poland on the 1st of September, British infantry sections mobilized with a clear understanding that doctrine and reality were about to collide. The Bren gun, in service barely a year, would face its first comprehensive test, not in colonial scrub warfare, but against the most modern military machine in Europe. The British Expeditionary Force that deployed to France in late 1939 carried Brens as standard section equipment. Sergeant Morrison, now deployed with the 1st Battalion near the Belgian border, supervised his gunner with the careful attention of a man who understood that the weapon he had once resented was now the difference between suppression and slaughter. The first real test came not in France, but in the minds of men who had to trust their lives to unfamiliar tools. Morrison's gunner, Private Dennis Hayes, was 21 and had never fired a shot in anger. He cleaned the Bren with obsessive care, memorizing the sequence of disassembly and reassembly until he could do it blindfolded. At night, in the barracks near Arras, Morrison would hear the quiet click of parts being fitted together, Hayes running through the sequence in darkness, building muscle memory that might matter when visibility and fine motor control both disappeared under fire. "You'll do fine," Morrison told him one evening. "The weapon works. Trust it." "I trust the weapon," Hayes replied. "I'm just not sure about myself." Morrison understood that distinction. The Bren was perfect. The men operating it were human, prone to panic, exhaustion, error. The question wasn't whether the gun would function, but whether the gunner would. That question was answered on a muddy morning in May 1940, when German forces swept through the Ardennes and doctrine finally met its reckoning. Morrison's section occupied a roadblock position outside a village whose name he would forget, but whose coordinates would haunt him forever. German infantry probed their position at dawn, not the massed charges of Great War mythology, but coordinated fire and movement, supported by MG-34s that carved the morning apart with 800 rounds per minute. "Contact front!" Morrison bellowed, and Hayes dropped prone behind the Bren with the mechanical precision of 1,000 training repetitions. The first burst was short, controlled, 5 rounds. The German advance faltered. Hayes adjusted his aim and fired again, another 5 rounds. Morrison watched through binoculars as the enemy section went to ground, their advance momentum broken by accurate fire they couldn't suppress with return volleys. The MG-34 opened up from a tree line 400 meters out, a sound like ripping canvas, sustained and devastating. But the German gun crew was trying to suppress an entire British section, while Hayes had one job: keep them from advancing. He fired in controlled bursts, changing barrels when the first grew too hot to touch, fed by Morrison with practiced efficiency. The Bren's slower rate of fire, 500 rounds per minute versus the German gun's 800, proved tactically perfect. Every round was aimed. Every burst achieved its purpose. After 20 minutes, the German probe withdrew. Morrison's section had suffered no casualties. That night, Hayes sat with the Bren across his knees, hands trembling from adrenaline rather than fear. "It works," he said, his voice carrying wonder. "It actually works." Morrison thought about all the reports filed from the northwest frontier, the trials at Enfield, the technical debates and procurement resistance. All of that institutional friction had produced this moment, a 21-year-old private discovering that the weapon he carried would keep him alive. "Of course it works," Morrison said. "Someone spent years making sure it would." In Prague, Václav Holek sat in his occupied workshop, listening to German radio reports of Wehrmacht advances through France. He did not know that British sections armed with his design were holding defensive positions against German infantry using the same tactical principles he had encoded into the weapon's DNA. He knew only that somewhere across the chaos of war, the idea he had built was being tested in the only laboratory that mattered, and he hoped, because hope was the only certainty left, that it was saving more lives than it was taking. The vindication came not in a single moment, but in accumulated weight: battle reports, tactical adjustments, the quiet reorganization of how British infantry thought about firepower. By mid-1940, as the British Expeditionary Force withdrew from Dunkirk and regrouped to defend the homeland, every after-action report from France mentioned the Bren in tones of professional respect. Officers who had questioned its necessity now requested additional allocation. Training courses restructured entirely around squad automatic weapon tactics. The gun that had entered service as a foreign innovation had become, in less than 2 years of war, the indispensable foundation of British infantry doctrine. But the true test, the one that would transform tactical respect into strategic dependence, came in North Africa. The Western Desert was a laboratory that stripped away all pretense. Heat that turned metal too hot to touch. Sand that infiltrated every mechanism. Distances where tactical engagements occurred at ranges that made pre-war doctrine look like fantasy. Soldiers learned quickly that complexity was the enemy, that the weapons which survived were the ones built with margins for abuse. The Bren thrived. Lieutenant William Crawford, commanding a section of the 7th Armoured Division near Tobruk in 1941, filed a report that circulated through British headquarters with the force of revelation. In 3 months of desert operations, our Bren guns have functioned without significant failure. Meanwhile, Italian Bredas jam regularly, German MG-34s require constant cleaning, and our own boys' anti-tank rifles have proven nearly useless. The Bren is the only weapon I trust without reservation. The simplicity that George Patchett's team at Enfield had preserved from Holek's original design, the gas piston system that required no special tools, the barrel change that a soldier could execute blindfolded, the tolerances engineered for reliability over precision, proved perfectly suited for conditions where sophistication meant death. But Crawford's report contained a detail that would ripple through both British and German tactical thinking. During a patrol action on 15th of April, we overran a German position and recovered 2 of our own Bren guns that had been captured in previous engagements. The Germans had been using them, apparently with great effectiveness, as their own MG-34 replacements had failed in the sand. When that information reached German intelligence, the response was immediate and telling. Wehrmacht technical evaluations of captured British equipment typically ranged from dismissive to damning. The Bren evaluation, filed in July 1941, read differently. The enemy's light machine gun designated Bren demonstrates superior reliability in desert conditions compared to our own MG-34. Design features particularly noteworthy: rapid barrel change capability, simple gas regulation system, minimal parts requiring specialized tools. Recommend detailed analysis for potential adaptation to future designs. The weapon, designed in Czechoslovakia, perfected in England, was reshaping German tactical doctrine through the simple mathematics of reliability under stress. The major twist came in November 1942 during the Second Battle of El Alamein. Sergeant Morrison, now commanding a full platoon, positioned his sections along a defensive ridge south of the main thrust. German armor and infantry probed the position for 3 days, seeking the weak points that would allow breakthrough. Morrison's platoon, 36 men with 4 Bren guns, held a frontage that doctrine said required a full company. They held because the Brens worked. Hour after hour, through sandstorms and artillery bombardment and probing attacks, the guns maintained suppressive fire that made German infantry movement prohibitively costly. Morrison watched his gunners swap barrels with mechanical precision, feed belts of ammunition, clear the occasional jam without breaking rhythm. On the 3rd day, a German patrol overran one of Morrison's forward positions. The Bren crew was forced to withdraw, abandoning their weapon. Morrison expected it to be destroyed or carried off. Instead, 2 hours later, his observation post reported German infantry using the captured Bren in a counterattack against a neighboring British section. The weapon had no loyalty. It served whoever understood its language. When the battle ended and British forces pursued the retreating Afrika Korps west toward Tunisia, Morrison recovered the Bren his section had lost. It was covered in sand, the barrel scorched from sustained fire, but mechanically sound. A German soldier had scratched something into the stock in rough letters. Besser als MG-34, better than the MG-34. Morrison showed the inscription to his company commander, who photographed it for intelligence purposes. That photograph eventually reached London, where procurement officers and tactical planners absorbed a truth that the Empire's pride had resisted for a decade, that acknowledging foreign excellence was not weakness but wisdom, that the best tools came not from national superiority, but from honest engineering confronting real problems. By 1943, Bren production had increased to match the scale of Britain's expanding armies. Factories in Enfield, Birmingham and Monaghan worked 3 shifts. The weapon appeared not just in British hands, but throughout the Commonwealth, Canadian infantry at Ortona, Australian sections in New Guinea, Indian troops in Burma, South African forces in Italy. The tactical doctrine that had once viewed squad automatic weapons with suspicion now couldn't function without them. Infantry training manuals were rewritten to center on the Bren as the foundation of section firepower. Officers planned movements around its suppression capabilities. Logistical chains prioritized its ammunition supply. The weapon had stopped being an innovation and become infrastructure, invisible in its ubiquity, essential in its function. In late 1944, as Allied forces pushed through France toward Germany, Private Hayes, now a corporal with 2 years of combat experience, carried a Bren with serial number that traced back to one of the first production runs from 1938. The weapon had been refurbished twice, had its barrel changed 17 times, and had fired an estimated 40,000 rounds. It still functioned perfectly. Hayes was interviewed by a war correspondent who asked the obligatory question, "What weapon would you choose if you could carry anything?" "This one," Hayes said, patting the Bren with the casual affection reserved for reliable tools. "It's kept me alive from France to here. I don't need anything else." The correspondent asked if he knew who designed it. Hayes admitted he didn't. Some engineer somewhere, he guessed. Someone who understood what we needed before we did. That was as close to historical recognition as Václav Holek would receive during the war. His name appeared in patent filings and technical documents, known to procurement specialists and armaments historians, but invisible to the soldiers whose lives his design protected. In occupied Prague, Holek continued working under German supervision, maintaining production of weapons that now fought on multiple sides of the same war. The moral calculus was impossible. Every gun he built could save a life or take one, liberate or oppress, depending entirely on who pulled the trigger. Anna asked him once if he took pride in what he had created. "Pride is the wrong word," he said. "I take responsibility. The weapon exists because I willed it into existence. What happens with it afterward is history's burden, not mine." But late at night, when radio reports came through about Allied advances, he allowed himself to wonder if somewhere in the vast machinery of war, his idea was doing more good than harm. If the mathematics of his design, 30 rounds per minute, reliable suppression, mobile firepower, were saving more lives than doctrine's stubborn resistance had cost, he would never know with certainty. But uncertainty, he had learned, was the only honest relationship an inventor could have with the consequences of innovation. The war in Europe ended in May 1945 with a silence that felt heavier than the noise that had preceded it. Victory came not in a single moment, but in accumulated exhaustion. Armies running out of space to retreat, ideologies running out of believers, nations running out of reasons to continue dying. Václav Holek listened to the announcement of German surrender from his workshop in Prague, now liberated but changed in ways that made liberation feel like an incomplete description. The Czechoslovakia he had known, the young republic that had given him purpose and funding to build the ZB Vezesten 26, no longer existed. Soviet influence was reshaping the political landscape. The factory that had once served Czech independence would soon serve different masters with different certainties. He was 49 years old. Half his life had been spent thinking about automatic weapons and squad-level firepower. The other half had been spent learning that being right was never enough, that innovation required not just technical brilliance, but political timing, institutional humility, and the patience to outlast resistance. Anna found him in the workshop on the evening of Victory Day, sitting at the same workbench where he had designed the gas piston system 21 years earlier. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I built something that lasted longer than the nations that needed it." It was true in ways he was only beginning to understand. The Bren gun, his design, filtered through British engineering and manufactured at scales he had never imagined, had become infrastructure across the English-speaking world. It equipped not just British forces, but Canadian, Australian, Indian, South African, and New Zealand armies. It had served in every theatre of the war, Europe, Africa, Asia, the Pacific Islands, and it wasn't finished. The first major twist came in the late 1940s, during the post-war drawdown, when military planners expected equipment to be obsolete and discarded. Instead, Commonwealth nations retained the Bren as standard issue. New production runs began. Adaptations for different calibers were tested. The weapon that had been designed for one war was being prepared for the conflicts everyone knew were coming. Korea, 1950, Malaya, 1948, Suez, 1956. Each conflict reconfirmed the Bren's tactical utility. British and Commonwealth forces deployed with weapons that Holek had conceptualized in the 1920s, and those weapons continued to perform exactly as designed: reliable, mobile, effective. George Patchett, retiring from Enfield in 1959, gave an interview to an armaments journal, where he was asked about his most significant contribution to British defence. "I didn't invent anything," he said with characteristic modesty. "I translated. The Czechs had solved the problem. We just made it speak English." He was asked if he had ever met Václav Holek. "No," Patchett admitted. "But I've spent 30 years thinking about how he thinks." That's its own kind of relationship. The second major twist came in the 1960s, when newly independent nations began establishing their own defence industries. India, having inherited Bren production capabilities from the British Raj, continued manufacturing the weapon into the 1980s. Canada produced variants chambered for 7.62-meter NATO. The design that had started in a Brno workshop had become a global standard, manufactured on 4 continents and serving in dozens of armies. But the final twist, the one that would have astonished both Holek and the British procurement officers who had resisted adopting his design, came in the 1990s. British forces were still using the Bren, 60 years after its initial deployment, 50 years after its designer had passed away in obscurity, 30 years after the empire that had adopted it had dissolved into smaller sovereignties. The L4 variant, chambered for 7.62-meter NATO, served British forces through the Cold War, through the Falklands, through the early years of peacekeeping operations that would eventually give way to new kinds of warfare requiring new kinds of tools. When the Bren was finally retired from British service in the mid-1990s, military historians noted that it had outlasted every tactical doctrine that had tried to replace it. That its fundamental approach to squad automatic weapons, reliable, mobile, sustainable fire, had proven more durable than any specific technological implementation. Sergeant Morrison, retired and in his 70s, was interviewed by a BBC documentary crew making a programme about World War II infantry tactics. He was asked what he remembered most vividly from his service. "The sound of the Bren," he said without hesitation. 30 rounds per minute, measured, deliberate. You could hear it and know your section had teeth. Did he know who designed it? Morrison admitted he'd learned the name later, decades after the war. Holek, he said, pronouncing it carefully. Czech fellow. Never got much recognition. Did that seem fair? Morrison considered the question with the seriousness of a man who had spent 6 years learning the difference between fair and true. Fairness is for peacetime, he finally said. War just is. But I'll tell you this. That man saved my life more times than I can count, and he never knew my name either. Maybe that's the trade. He builds the tools. We use them. And history tries to remember both, but usually only gets one. Václav Holek died in 1968 in Prague during the brief flowering of the Prague Spring, before Soviet tanks reminded Czechoslovakia which certainties were permitted. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his work in armaments design, but focused more on his hobbies: woodworking, chess, mentoring young engineers. Anna outlived him by 12 years. She donated his technical papers to a military museum where they were catalogued and largely forgotten, except by specialists researching the genealogy of automatic weapons. But the weapon endured in ways neither of them could have predicted. Museums across the Commonwealth displayed Brens with plaques explaining their service history. Veterans associations included it in commemorative displays. Collectors sought early production models, with the careful reverence reserved for objects that had mattered in ways beyond their immediate function. And in the minds of the soldiers who had carried it, fewer each year, as age claimed what war had not, the Bren remained perfect. Not because it was technically sophisticated, but because it had been technically appropriate. It had solved the problem it was meant to solve. It had kept working when everything else failed. It had been, in the most fundamental sense, enough. The final historical twist came in the 2010s, when military analysts began serious study of what they called developmental dead ends. Weapons systems that had promised revolution but failed to deliver. The Bren was studied as a counterpoint, a weapon that had promised nothing except reliability and had delivered exactly that for 60 years. A doctoral thesis at King's College London, analysing interwar small arms development, concluded, "The Bren represents the triumph of honest engineering over institutional vanity. Its adoption required Britain to acknowledge that excellence could emerge from unexpected sources and that national pride was less valuable than soldiers' lives. That lesson, as much as the weapon itself, may be the Bren's lasting contribution." Holek would have appreciated the irony, that his greatest contribution wasn't the weapon, but the humility required to accept it. In the end, it wasn't the Bren that endured. Weapons always fade into museums and memory. It was the idea that changed everything, that squad-level firepower, reliable and mobile, was not a luxury, but a necessity, that the best designs answered questions honestly rather than impressively. That being right before anyone believed you was the hardest kind of victory and the loneliest. Somewhere in the vast inventory of history, a 23-pound piece of steel and walnut whispered its truth to anyone willing to listen, that the minds behind weapons carry burdens the weapons themselves never know, and that vindication, when it finally comes, often arrives too late for the people who needed it most. But it arrives. And in arriving, it changes the world in ways that outlast empires, doctrines, and the certainties that both depend upon. If this story reminded you that changing the world often means being right before anyone believes you, subscribe to the channel. Tell us which country you watch from and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.